So we can get started. Just a bit of a background about me. I just finished my PhD at Berkeley last year, and I'll be starting a faculty position at Princeton. And in the meantime, I'm spending some time at Deepmind trying to understand what it means to have robot policies that you can scale up, learn from large models, understand what this foundation model version of generalist robot policies looks like. So everything we'll see today is mostly the last maybe 6 to 8 months of research we've been doing at Deepmind in trying to understand this task of manipulation and general purpose manipulation, the methods, evals, and so on. So to get started, maybe just to throw this out to the room, we've heard this term a lot. If you're on Twitter these days, if you read the news, somehow robotics has been completely commoditized in the last few months, and everybody thinks we're going to have general purpose robots roaming around our houses and everywhere else. So maybe for the next minute or so, maybe back to the audience, when you hear the word a generalist policy or a general purpose robot, what does it mean to you? Just scream it out aloud. What are some keywords?
Something that can do two very disparate tasks or more.
Okay.
I can treat it as a human being and expect it to be able to do what I ask my friend to do.
Okay, that's a high bar. Any more? Yeah.
It doesn't seem to optimize any one particular multiple things.
Okay, so it can do multiple things. Very similar to what you said, it can do two very different things. It can behave predictably with other people, like other people. Anything else?
It can work in multiple different environments.
Multiple environments.
Inside, outside, walking, manipulating.
Okay.
Potentially.
Can do lots of very different things in very different environments. Okay, so just to maybe narrow down the scope for the rest of this talk, we're going to be talking about generalist manipulation policies, policies that are going to interact with the world with their hands or grippers or arms or something like that. And a lot of these interesting suggestions came up, so I'll eventually update my word cloud with more things that we put on there. But typically what we hear people say when they hear generalist policies, it's some version of it can do anything or anything that's feasible with the embodiment. It can go to any environment. It can zero-shot generalize to new tasks. It'll listen to you in language, or it'll behave like your friend would, or it can control multiple different robots and so on. And generally, all of these are true for different versions of how you say this and how based on who you ask. And it's going to stay ambiguous, and I think we'll all have our own definitions of what a generalist policy means. So what I want to show you next is a video of an interaction I had with my robot a few months ago with a dexterous, what I would call a generalist policy. And then I'll try to have I'll put this out as my version of what I mean a generalist robot policy is going to be. And then the rest of this talk, we'll explore different variants of this. So hopefully the audio works, and I'll be silent for a minute or two. So to set the context for this, this is, we'll get into the details of what you're looking at, but this is a tabletop manipulation problem where you have these two arms, these two black arms with parallel jaw grippers, and there's a lot of objects present on the table. Some of these objects were seen during training, some of them were not, and this is me as a human being going to my robot, and this is my work desk. Hey, robot. Okay.
Hi, how can I help you today?
We're going to clean up this table together. What do you see in front of you?
I see a yellow marker, a notebook, a red marker, a green cloth, a pair of glasses, a glasses case, a calculator, a paper cup, a stapler, and a white basket.
Oof, that's a lot. Where do you think the yellow marker goes?
I think the yellow marker should go in the pen holder.
All right, can you put it there?
Yes.
Can you also put the red marker there?
Yes.
Let's do the same for the black marker.
Yes.
I got it. All right, how about putting the glasses in its cases now?
Yes.
And can you put the case away in the white basket?
Yes.
All right, can you put the calculator in the white basket?
Yes.
And the stapler in the gray basket?
Yes.
Okay, so you get the point. There's a lot of things on the table, and I'm messing with the table. I'm moving things around. You have to take my word for it when I say this was not a very specific place where I put it. It was just kind of me randomly throwing things on there. And that is for the most part true. So we have this policy that we can command in natural language. It is completely fine with objects being at different places. It has some sense of what an object is, again, in language, where the receptacle is, what a gray basket is. If I move it, it interacts with me, and so on. And I really like that interaction because to me, not that long ago, this is what I thought would be fun. It was a robot that I could ask to do things. It would kind of meaningfully do something. It can do a lot of different tasks. It can pick up different objects. It can do them with 2 hands. It can do this handovers, bimanual coordination, and all of this, it's learning mostly from real world data. It's not pre-programmed in any specific way. So to make things less ambiguous for the rest of this talk, let me try to define my version of what a generalist policy is. And it's going to be very similar to what we saw in the previous slide. So to me, this is a policy, a model running on a robot that can do a large set of things really, really well. It's not going to do everything. I think the do everything policy is a few years away, if you ask me. But it can do a set of things which I would define beforehand when I decide what the scope of my robot is. And it can do those things really well. This would be a variety of skills, like picking things up, putting them, unzipping a bag, maybe doing a handover, kneading dough, pouring water into a cup, whatever set of things that you care about. And it can do this with a variety of objects. So it cannot only pick up a specific marker or a specific ball. If I say it has a general pick policy, it should be able to pick a lot of different objects together. And this should work in different settings, which could look like different lighting conditions with background distractors, other objects, the objects placed in different places with some obstacles, paraphrasing and how I describe the instruction, and so on. And another attribute, which is not fully captured by this notion of doing things well, is it should understand what I ask it to do. So in this case, for the rest of this talk, we're going to focus on commanding the robot in natural language. And it should be steerable in natural language. It should understand what the user means, ground those instructions in what it sees in front of it, in its observations, and then act in that world. So to me, these two characteristics, I'm going to call them generalization and steerability. Full caveat, the word generalization means way too many things. And there's a real definition, there's a formal, semi-formal, everybody says different things. So I'm going to say this is what generalization is, and at the bottom is what steerability is. And I argue that these are two really important properties to have if you want to have the kind of generalist robot policy which is fun to play with. Let's not talk about useful, but it'll be something that you'll enjoy having around and you will actively interact with it. So for this talk, my plan is to first introduce what we meant by generalization in a slightly more principled way. We'll talk about what it actually means to generalize, where do we start, where does it go from there, and talk about evaluating, about how we would evaluate some of the current set of models, the current generation of models, what they're good at generalizing to, what they're not, and what it tells us about what kind of research we should be doing. I'll then talk about the other attribute, which is steerability, see why some of the current generation of models struggle with this kind of steerability, and what it would mean to improve language conditioning, language steerability for these policies. And lastly, for the bit of the talk that's going to be less technical, I'll talk about how we took some of these ideas and combined with a lot of other ideas that maybe I can't get into many details for, and how we went into scaling up models, these generalist VLA-style models, to get to the demo that we opened this talk with. And we'll start with evaluating generalization. What it is, how do we measure it, how do we report it, and understand what it really means. So the key questions that I want to start this section with, oh, by the way, questions. If there's any questions, kind of raise your hand, and we can try to do them as they come up. I can do longer pauses for questions at the end of each section, and at the end, we'll probably do a longer Q&A section where we'll just stop recording and you can ask me anything at the time. Otherwise, I might have to punt some questions. When we're thinking about generalization, really the question at the core of that is, what types of generalization do we care about? We talked about these different things like lighting conditions and initial poses and backgrounds, but is there a way where we can systematically write all of them down, group them in a certain way, and then have these categories which will allow us to predict some meaningful properties of these models? And then eventually, once we've come up with a notion of types and categories of these models, how would we measure generalization? How do we report it in numbers or in a table or something that other people can track? So before going further, just so we're all on the same page, we have a cute robot. The robot runs a policy pi. The class of policies that we're going to talk about here is what are known as vision language action models, or language condition visual policies. So you have visual observations, which is generally an RGB image captured by a camera that's on the robot or on the side and looking at the robot, looking at the scene. We have the task, which is defined by a language instruction. In this case, from the bridge data set, you have this notion of this toy sink, which is the scene, and you have a carrot, and the language instruction is to put the carrot away into the plate. And then, based on this, the policy must understand what the observations are, look at the language, and then take actions in the real world. In this case, this would be commanding joint velocities or positions to the end of the gripper, so it takes actions. And what I want to argue here is that when we think about generalization, a very natural categorization for generalization is to be based on these three different policy modalities. So we have images and language going in, we have actions going out. And we can try to think of generalization in terms of these three broad categories. So if we have a base task, let me see if I can get this thing away. It doesn't want to go away. Okay. Okay, so let's say we have a base task. This base task again is carrot, put the carrot on a plate. A perturbed version of this task could be put the carrot away on the plate, but in a red colored sink. This is not a real red sink. I just kind of manipulated the image using an off-the-shelf model. So we have a version of the task which is doing the same thing semantically and meaningfully, but the visual observations look very different. So this would be a visual perturbation to the base task to give us a new task. But like I said at the start, if you think this generalist policy can work well in slight variations, it should still succeed at putting the carrot away on a plate. Something else you could change is the language modality, what we call semantic perturbations, where instead of saying put the carrot on a plate, you use a synonym of a carrot, like put the orange object on the plate, put the root vegetable on a plate. And similarly, the third category is the outputs, which is the actions. So we talk about behavioral perturbations, which require different actions to achieve the task itself. So in this case, the task is still to put the carrot on the plate, but the carrot starts at a different position in the sink. So if you think of a policy that can only put the carrot away from the top to the bottom, this would be considered an out-of-distribution evaluation setting, and you want your policy to actually generalize to that new evaluation setting. So what we propose in this project, which was led by Sunil and Jensen at Stanford in Dorsa's lab, is this version of generalization that I very hand-wavily defined in this talk. This version of generalization can be measured just as a measure of robustness to perturbation along these different axes. So if you have vision, language, and action models, by perturbing these three different modalities, if we just measure how the policy performance changes in these three different perturbations, we can make this a way to measure how the model generalizes, how it acts, and so on. So concretely, let's say you start with a base task, like we've seen in the past. You have this carrot and a plate task. We want to modify the base task by changing one specific kind of factor. In this case, it could be changing the lighting conditions and so on. That factor can be obtained by doing a fine-grained grouping of different perturbations. So lighting can be considered a broad factor that can change lighting, like adding a new light source or changing the color of the bulb or adding multiple lights and so on. We'll then define an axis as a grouping of all factors that are somewhat similar. So in the case of lighting conditions, as well as maybe cropping the image or skewing the aspect ratio a little bit, you can have a notion of image augmentations, which is this broad axis of variations where you can change the image in a lot of different ways. And you want to make sure that the policy is okay with these small augmentations that are done in the image space. And finally, we'll take all of the axes that are somewhat related. Let's say in this case, all the axes related to the input that is an image input, and we would call it a visual category. And this gives us a way to basically take all the different evaluation conditions that you want your policy to generalize to and make all of that work in, represent all of that in this new way of measuring generalization. So we propose this thing called the StarGen taxonomy. It's a taxonomy for talking about generalization. And the way we go about this is very simple. I'm going to talk about it for the fourth time now. We start with a base task. We still love carrots. We want to put them in a plate. And to try to generate different versions of this task so we can evaluate it, we'll first start with making these three categories. We have visual, semantic, and behavioral. A lot of the perturbations we care about actually happen at the overlap of these categories. So let's say we have this giant circle of different kinds of categories that you care about, that if the policy works in the base task, it should also work in a lot of these different settings, and it should generalize to these different settings. So for each of these categories, we can now instantiate all of these different axes. So going around in the semantic sense, it's a notion of multi-reference objecting. So rather than multi-referencing an object, where rather than just talking about an object directly, you would try to reference it through different ways. You can talk about properties like color of the object. You can rephrase it. You could use different languages to refer to it. On the behavioral side, you would change the position of these objects. You can have obstacles. The scene has new changes. On the visual side, you can have the viewpoint changing and so on. And roughly, what this giant map shows you is what hand-wavily we meant by robustness to perturbations. If I give you a policy that works in a certain setting, how confident am I that it's going to work in all of these perturbed settings? And put differently, if I am going to go in a completely new setting, how much do I need to assume about the visual and semantic and behavioral homogeneity for this thing to work? So we'll do one last round of examples for a different kind of task. So in this case, the task is to flip this pot, which is this plastic pot in a similar sink, and make it upright. And I'm going to run through a few different examples of perturbations of this task that we want the model to work in. So the first one is just very simple. It's just viewpoints. In this case, the camera moves a little bit higher up. The viewpoint is a bit different. And as a human, when you look at it, it doesn't look this different. But if you typically train a policy just from a single viewpoint, it will completely break from a different viewpoint. So we really want to make sure that a generalist policy would have this kind of visual robustness. For a different way of referring to the task, instead of calling it a pot, you could say, flip the object that can be used for boiling water and make it upright. Now, the task is the same, the data is the same, but it really needs to understand that the object that can be used to boil water is a pot. And hopefully this is something that the language model backbone of your VLA would get you. Hopefully, we'll see if it does. On the behavioral side, this is an example of an object pose perturbation. So at the very start, instead of the pan being a certain way, it's actually a different way. I can't see how it is pointing a different way. So again, it looks very similar, but if you've never seen behaviors of picking the pot from the top, the policy might never know how to do that. So if you believe that this is a generalist policy, it should be able to deal with different poses. And similarly, here's a different version of a pot that's a metallic pot instead of a plastic pot, and you would want that to work as well. And finally, if you know what flipping a pot is, hopefully you've learned a skill which is called flipping, which you can now apply to a completely different object, which in this case is a transparent cup. And this would be at the intersection of all the different axes we've talked about, and maybe a very hard version of generalizing a skill to a completely different object. And we took this taxonomy, which we submitted a paper about this, which is an archive. We took this taxonomy and we put up this software online where people can upload an image for a base task that they care about. In this case, it's the sink and carrot task again. And using a Gemini running in the cloud, they can actually generate a lot of different perturbations of this. So in this case, they've generated different visual perturbations where the plate looks different and the knives look different. And the model now is just kind of, this tool is suggesting you how you should change your evaluation settings so you can automatically come up with different variations. And we're hoping that this is the way people start reporting different generalization behaviors when for every task that you care about reporting your success rate in a paper, you can now generate a lot of these different subtasks and try to evaluate and see what it looks like. So let's try to do this analysis. We did this on the bridge data set. The bridge data set is a tabletop manipulation data set. And we tried to do the similar analysis where we started with a pre-trained generalist policy. And again, generalist is a loose word, but we started with a policy that was trained starting from a VLM on bridge data. We collect in-domain demos for some base tasks, for a handful of base tasks. We collect some demos of just the base task. We co-fine-tune the policy with the bridge data as well as the base task that we added, and then we'll evaluate across all of these perturbations. So this is an axis with something, this is a taxonomy with about 20 axes. So for each base task, we'll evaluate all of this, and then we'll plot average success rate. For evaluations, we'll start with 3 open source models. OpenVLA, which is the classic vanilla first open source to VLA model, which starts with a llama backbone, fine-tunes it to have an action head. We'll compare with mini VLA, which is a smaller version of OpenVLA. Very similar architecture with 2 changes. It has a smaller language model backbone, and it uses vector quantization for actions. And we'll work with maybe a slightly more modern architecture, which is Pi0. It uses a much more powerful VLM backbone, which is polygemma, and flow-based action chunking to supposedly help with better learning of actions. So here's an example. So we're going to plot these things in the spherical spider chart where we're going to say for each of these different dotted lines you see, these are different axes in our taxonomy that we care about. And the black axis on the right is ID or in distribution. So right now, the way you would be comparing these models, you would just evaluate them in distribution. You would report their success rates, and you'd say my model, which is, let's say, it looks like mini VLA and Pi0 are better than OpenVLA. Done. I have a paper. I'm done. But instead, what we want to see is we propose this taxonomy. Can we try getting some more interpretable signals from this and guide research? So the first things we see, very unsurprisingly, there is actually a lot of improvement we get just from architecture. So it's not all about the data. Using a better VLM, which has presumably learned better visual representations, actually improves performance across the board. And we see that the brown curve, which is Pi0, it's better at semantic, it's better at visual, it's better at behavioral a little bit. And that's all, that all stays true, which is great. In general, it looks like if you look at the visual side of the board, especially with new objects and distractors, the models are actually really good, which makes sense. We have giant visual representations that we've learned, and it makes sense that generally speaking, the visual and in-distribution numbers are similar. There are some interesting things to flag. Viewpoint is something our models completely struggle with right now. This could be a data thing, this could be an architecture thing, not to go into too many details there, but clearly there's a lot of these valleys of bad performance. But perhaps the most surprising thing to me and to a lot of my co-authors was that semantic generalization looks really bad. I thought we switched to VLAs so we would get this beautiful language and vision grounding and we would understand a lot of these interesting things, but it looks like we still don't work very well in the semantic generalization categories. And then lastly, on the behavioral side at the bottom, a lot of things are just zeros and really hard. That just seems to suggest that we're doing something fundamentally wrong. And I don't have any answers on how we're improving this on the next slide, but this was a very alarming thing to find out. And it's what's really nice about trying to plot this in this 2D spider chart is now we have a very clear sense of what works and what doesn't, and what has almost nothing to do with architectural improvements, so we can start improving it. Couple of quick things on data. So in this setting, we have the same model, so there is no architectural difference. The pink curve is the pre-trained model only starting with training on the base model, which is base data set, which is bridge data. And then on the bottom, we have the one that's trained on OXE, which is this cross-embodiment data set that's about 10 times larger on 20 different robots, different university labs, lots of it going on. And surprise, surprise, data diversity is good. No one's surprised. Of course, data is good. We have more data. More data means more visual diversity, more language diversity, more behavior diversity. Not that surprising. If I wanted to get a good bridge model, and if I had to collect more data, what kind of data would I collect? Does diversity mean it should be more diverse labels, more diverse scenes, more diverse lighting? Unclear. not answered by anything in this paper. But this will kick off a lot of future research directions, which we're excited about. And lastly, thinking about the fact that this is a VLM that we're starting from, we can do training on non-robot data. We have VQA data sets that we could co-train with these models, and what we see is generally doing VQA co-training tends to help, primarily in the visual domains, not so much in the others. But a really good question here again is, how do we weight this VLM co-training with the actions co-training? What are we learning in these two different phases, and how do we go from there? So, skipping ahead to try to wrap these things up. Quick takeaways from this study. This is a paper that's online. If you have any questions, we can talk about them too. But my main takeaway from this study was that we're really far from a convergence of architectures themselves. There is no such thing as a single VLA. There is no broad remarks we can make about an architecture because we're still changing. And every other week, there's new papers coming out. We learn how to do modeling better. And over time, there's a lot of research to be done there. Data still ends up being really important in this setting. Holding the model's architecture same, but changing what data you train on can massively influence the performance you get. And a lot of research is being done and will continue being done on data. And I guess for anybody who thought, generalist robot friends are tomorrow, we have a long way to go. We still have a lot of things we need to do. And every time you report numbers on a paper, try to break down your generalization performance, try to analyze what works and what doesn't, and that'll help you to understand what you're doing, but also spread your numbers better to the community. Great, okay, so we talked a lot about generalization. We're gonna spend a little bit of time now talking about steerability. Let's see, tuck, okay. Too many animations. Okay, so what do I mean by steerability? I very loosely touched on this at the very start. What I mean by steerability here is a very specific definition of it, as it's as defined at the start of the talk, which is the ability of this language conditioned policy to follow language instructions. The language instructions can be arbitrarily complex, they can be fine-grained. How do we make sure what is being commanded is actually what the robot does? And in some sense, I want to argue that in this definition, steerability is actually orthogonal to everything we talked about in generalization. You could be a really general policy, but if you're not steerable in distribution, it does not matter because you're still doing just the same things that you've seen before. So just to kind of go back to the setting that we were studying, let's look at this setup again. This is again the bridge data set with OpenVLA, which is this VLA model which starts from a llama VLM and then fine-tunes it with actions. And we see that for a lot of in-distribution tasks, actually really great. If you ask OpenVLA to put a spoon on a plate, it's going to put a spoon on the plate 10 out of 10 times. So it understands what a spoon is, and it understands what a plate is, right? Let's modify the scene a little bit. We now have two spoons, and I ask it to put a specific spoon on the plate. I don't think it understands what an orange spoon is. It's picking up one of the spoons on random. It's just going to have a default behavior. It maybe knows what a spoon is, but it doesn't really grant the fact that there is an orange spoon. Similarly here, it really does maybe know that there is something called a green spoon, but does it know broccoli, blocks? Not really. It's just picking one of the things at random. So it knows how to pick things. It's pretty good at picking things, but it doesn't really know what it's picking. And this kind of thing happens a lot. Oh, this looks low resolution. Anyway, let's say this is a different model. This is the Pi0 model on a panda. And you have this task where you say, pick up the red marker, put it in the cup. That succeeded. Awesome. Can it put a green marker and a purple marker? Nope, still red. Marker on the left? No. Okay, so it doesn't understand what left is. It doesn't understand different colors. It's just kind of, by default, it knows how to pick up a marker. It's going to pick up a marker. It's going to put it in the cup. And this is true across a lot of different tasks, across a lot of different models. And this is not the kind of thing I started this video with, where we wanted to talk about things where you can very specifically point to a specific colored marker or a specific object. And why is that the case? Why is language steerability so hard with these models that are fundamentally built on top of language models? They were supposed to understand language. And my key hypothesis for the second part of this talk is that this is purely a labeling problem. This is this does have to do with the data, but for the most part, this is how you're labeling your data. So I would argue that most data sets that we play with, they don't carry enough language grounding signal in the trajectories. So when you look at the initial observation, you look at an image in your data set, the task distribution immediately collapses because in your data set, you have tasks that look like this. There is a label which says, flip the pot upright, but there isn't anything else to do in the scene. The only thing I can do is flip the pot upright. There is no other pot. There is no other thing I can pick up. On the right, it does understand what it is to move a spoon, but the scene had nothing else. It did not have to pay attention to the language to understand that it needed to move the spoon. So really what's happening is this notion of posterior collapse. The model completely ignores the conditioning signal that's coming through language because it doesn't need that language to learn good behaviors. So a simple idea we'll explore, and I'll try to go a little bit faster so we have time for questions after this, is that existing data sets, and not all of them, but a lot of existing data sets, are already behaviorally quite diverse. They have a lot of behavioral diversity, but they're not semantically diverse. They don't have labels that tell you how these behaviors are different. And because they don't, the models don't pay attention to that label. So to make the data more informative, we can do some tricks with the language labels themselves. And I'll talk about two ideas we've had in doing this, but very simply what we'll try to do is we'll take an existing data set and try to improve the language by doing very simple tricks so they start following language better. Okay, let's look at the first one. This is this notion of relabeling the data set for getting better steerability. So let's say we have a trajectory data set. This is a data set with images, language labels, and actions. And for the most part, this data set was collected for learning primitive skills. Skills like pick up an object, place it somewhere, or move it from left to right. And this is not a hypothetical data set. These are a lot of data sets. OpenVLA is a data set like this. Fractal, which is the example that we studied for this project, was a data set like this, where they had thousands of different pick and place tasks that they collected data on. But that's all it was. The label said, pick something up, place it somewhere. And it really didn't capture the nuance of what it's doing when it's picking and placing them. So what you could do is you take the same data set, and if you can find a way where you can rephrase the labels for each trajectory so that it says, oh, grasp this particular object in a particular way, or reorient the object so it matches a certain pose, or place it and put it in a slightly different setting, you can start by not changing the data set, but just changing the labels that are associated with these trajectories. And then do the same thing, no fancy policy learning required, just have your multitask policy on these new labels instead. And to give an example of how we can do this annotation, we started with a couple of very simple object-centric skills that can be described in language, like picking and grasping and lifting. And then we mostly noticed that the demonstrations that already exist in the data set, this notion of behaviorally diverse data sets, is actually true. We have human demonstrations already capturing a lot of this manifold of data sets, manifold of behaviors, and all we need to do is find out a way to talk about them. So let's look at one example of the grasp primitive. Like I said, all of this data has pick and place. So it knows how to pick something up. And because hundreds of operators were taught to pick up that object, they all picked it up in different ways, some from different directions, some from different hands. And what we then did is we took all of these different grasps, we calculated the grasp poses using the forward kinematics of the arm. So this visualization on the left kind of shows different directions in which the operators picked up the same object across different sessions and different days. So in this case, some of them picked them up from the side, some of them picked them up from the top. Even though the labels just said pick up, the behaviors were actually very, very different. We ran some very simpler k-means clustering, 4-means clustering, and we found out four very simple clusters, and we associated them with language labels. So we said all the ones that are in green, they are top-down grasps. All the things that's in magenta, they are diagonal grasps. So we took these labels, and we relabeled these things in our original data set. Similarly, we did this for a lot of other primitives. One of them was the place primitive, where rather than just saying place it on the table, you say place it in the right quadrant, or place it in 1,2 grid location by just coming up with an arbitrary grouping of the grids. And with no additional data collection, we've now just added a small amount of information in the labels that we've already collected. And instantly, what we see for grasping, for instance, is that green, which is our model, which is steer, this green policy actually works really well on the top right. If you try to try to ask it to do grasping from different poses, it actually does understand what top and side mean. It can do this thing called the potted plant, where there's actually like a leaf at the top and the base at the bottom. So you don't actually want to do top-down grasps. You want to do side grasps, and it can do that because now it knows what a side grasp is, and so on. And we noticed that without doing any of these augmentations, even a VLA model, which is OpenVLA in this case, it doesn't actually understand the nuances of languages for free. It's not that being a language model, it knows these things. It still needs to be taught that, and if you don't do that with the right annotations, you're losing that signal. And once you have something like this, once you have a policy that can exhibit these different parameterized primitives, if you will, you can pair it with your favorite VLM. So in this case, we had a VLM wrapper on top of this policy, and you just say, here's an image of the potted plant. How would you pick it up without disturbing it? And because every VLM now is really good at task planning, and it has some very simple common sense reasoning, your favorite VLM will tell you you should pick it up from the side and not from the top. So your VLM will then ask your low-level policy to just pick up the pod from the side, lift it up, and so on. And you can take this to arbitrary distances. So in this case, let's say the task you gave your policy was to pick up a cup which has a lot of beans in them and empty all the beans in a plate. Now remember, this data set was only a pick and place data set. There was no pouring data in the data set. But you could, a clever VLM could break down the task of pouring things into a plate into 4 primitives, pick up from the side, rotate it by 180 degrees, wait for all the beans to fall, rotate it back, put it on the side. And that's exactly what your VLM does. Your VLM now has access to these really powerful primitives where it can just ask the cup to pick it up, pour them using these primitives that it's learned by being stirrable, and then eventually place the cup on the side. And there's more examples, but I think you get the point. So here's an example of what happens in the same setting. So at the top, we have our model, which is commanded by a VLM, and it really kind of understands that it needs to pick up the potted plant from the side. The plant does fall off in one of the cases, but it does work. And in a lot of other cases, we don't actually see that happening. And lastly, even though this is being done just on the existing images and existing objects that are in your data set, we find that if you just do this on your entire data set and you come up with new objects, in this case, different colored cups or a different colored plant or this honey bottle, this notion of learning which direction to approach the object with actually does generalize. So in completely new settings, you can actually start to describe this very fine-grained language conditioning signal, which the policy is probably learning in a more inherent way. So that's great. We now actually have a policy that can be conditioned in different ways. But if you noticed, this was manually labeled. Laura, who was leading this project, she spent countless days looking at the data, trying to find ways in which you could specifically label grasps so that they look like a certain way, and so on. And if we really want this to be a scalable way to train big policies, we need to find a way to automate this. And we also made a very fundamental assumption, which does start breaking for many data sets. We assume that the behavioral diversity already exists. We cannot always assume that. We can always have data sets where there is only a single file behavior, and we'll talk about one of them in a few minutes. So to do that, we then need to figure out, if you have a data set that has very, very homogeneous behaviors, can you augment new behaviors? And you may not be able to do that for all cases, but we'll talk about an idea where you can. So if you have a data set that is not behaviorally diverse, where it's not just a labeling problem, it's actually a data problem itself, something you could do is you could sample counterfactual actions that are not in the data set, but generate new counterfactual actions using a suitable forward model, and then widen the data distribution. So then in an existing setting in your data set, you generate actions and behaviors that did not exist. You label them with new language, and that gives you a way to augment the data set in ways that were not already present in the model. I should mention that this is only possible if you can have a suitable forward model, and it's very hard to build good forward models in a lot of the settings. So I'll give an example of a case where it is not very, very hard. It is actually doable. So let's take this idea from navigation. So we have the setup here is you have this small home robot. It's like a Roomba with a camera on it and a computer on it. And this robot is, there's a lot of data that I've collected over the many past projects where we have data of humans either teleoperating the robot or a policy collecting data on this robot in lots of hallways and different home settings and so on. But if you look at a lot of the data that, a lot of collision-free navigation data that exists, most of it is kind of boring. Most of the data is going straight, avoiding collisions, and not doing anything interesting. So if I give you a large amount of navigation data, for the most part, it just has labels that say go straight and avoid collisions. But the nice thing about that is in that image space, there's actually a way to get a very easy forward model where you can sample collision-free actions so that you can get labels for actions that the robot did not take. So even though the robot always went straight, maybe it saw a couch on the right. And if you generate actions that go towards the couch just in this 2D space, you can augment the data set with that. So that's kind of what we did. I'm missing a slide here, so sorry about that. There was a little bit more context there. But very simple. Let's say we come up, you take an image. In a data set for navigation, you take an image. The image has a bunch of different things going on in the image. You ask a VLM to look at the image and propose future trajectories. So in this case, even if the robot just went straight in this setting, the lighting is off, but you could have labels that say, move away from the person or move towards the computer or go under the desk. And then with a very simple prompting mechanism from a paper called Pivot, you can actually plot these kind of additional actions that go into the future. So you can come up with 2D forward actions for collision-free actions that the robot can take. You can label them in language, you can roll them out, and then what this would look like is even though the model only took this orange trajectory which just went straight and took a right, you can now generate a lot of kind of sub-trajectories that were never actually taken by the robot, but you can pretend that they were, and you add that to your data set with alternative outcomes in language. So in this case, even though it just went straight out the door, you could have a version of the trajectory that might have taken a little bit of a left and gone towards the desks in this case, or it approached the desks, or it went behind a person, and so on. Again, this is only possible because in the case of 2D navigation, we actually have this kind of a forward model. We're trying to work on ways in which we can extend this to higher dimensional tasks, but we'll talk about that later. So we start with a data set. We have this data set which is uncurated for navigation. We pass it through a VLM, and the VLM generates a few different hypothetical things that it can do. It would look at the data, it would look at this glass door and say, I could go through it, I could take a right, I could take a left, even though that's not what the data set actually took. We pass it through this relabeling model, and then we get this augmented data set, which in this case, blue is the ground truth actions, green are the new actions that the robot generated, and we do a 50-50 training on top of 50-50 reweighting when we train on this. So we take real actions, which are important because they're clean and the actions are actually good. But we also take these other actions, which are maybe less clean, but have really good language grounding information. And then we train the same model on top of the same model that you're going to train before. You now train it using this augmented data set. And this model is a VLA model. I won't get into too many details, but it's like it's a model that takes images and language, passes it through a VIT and a sentence embedding and blah, 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 and it eventually gets to an action set. Okay. So this is the same VLA models that we've been talking about through this entire talk, but you condition it on all of these different things. And then what you see is somewhat similar to the trends we've seen in the past, where for a lot of different settings and a lot of different kinds of instructions, if you think of different ways in which you can do language conditioning. So ResNet plus film is just a language condition policy that looks like a giant 10, 20 million parameter policy. Atomic is a policy that is just a VLM with small primitives. So this would be the equivalent of just running a VLM directly controlling the robot, which tends to perform really well. Convoy is another method which uses VLMs, and then our method which uses this notion of counterfactual relabeling to actually augment the data set and train your own policy. And we see that we get across all the different tasks, we see a lot of improvements. And just to show some videos to end this section of the talk, even though the original data set mostly had the model roaming around in a straight line. This is in Berkeley. I see a lot of people recognize this corridor. Many nights were spent here. So you have this corridor and you have a lot of open areas. For the most part, the robot didn't do anything interesting. But by relabeling these trajectories, you can actually start getting the robot to do things like go towards this purple cushion, or go towards the traffic cone, or take a left, or move along the bench, but don't run into the bench. And this would be a behavior that you would never have in a teleoperated data set. Why would you go so close to an obstacle? Anyway, all of that to say, if we really care about steerability, there's two cases to think about this. There's the case where the data sets were already behaviorally diverse, and what you need to focus on is increasing the semantic diversity of the data set. And there's the case where it's not already behaviorally diverse, and we have an idea where we can use counterfactual actions to augment the data set itself, and we saw some results for there.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Super cool stuff. Can you explain how you generate the image sequence that corresponds to a counterfactual action sequence without some kind of a new generation modeler? It sounds like there was an existing work that did that, but could you give us a little bit more detail?
Yeah, so to clarify on that, there is no image sequence that is generated, only actions are generated. So the policy is current observation, language, and a future second of actions. So you never have to run the image model forward. We tried it, it's hard. Getting really good consistent image actions is very hard. Okay, so what I want to do next is talk a little bit about how some of these ideas, along with other things, came together into this video that I opened the talk with, and run the analysis that we did so far on generalization and steerability for that model. We'll try to keep it brief, about 5 to 8 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Just as a disclaimer on this specific section of the talk, this part is going to cover some proprietary work. I may not be able to answer a lot of technical questions about the architecture or the data or so on. So I'll try to scope the next few slides primarily on the first two parts and how they apply to scaling up VLAs in terms of how they generalize, how steerable they are, and how we would evaluate them. So this project is called Gemini Robotics. It's a giant project which we did at Deepmind, where we combined a team of 100 people working on both the frontier Gemini VLM models and the actions models, and took maybe a first very principled approach at what it might look like to build a VLA from scratch. When we try to do this in an academic lab for all the papers we've seen so far, you start with the model somebody has put out, and then you fine-tune that model. If you had the ability to pre-train your own model, what would this look like? So as a quick overview of what this project looked like, I wouldn't talk about all of the different settings, but what this project started with is we start with Gemini 2.0, which as of a couple of months ago was one of the frontier vision language action models. And we go through this process of adding robotic-specific capabilities to the VLM. So this would be things like spatial reasoning, embodied reasoning, doing object detection, pointing, detecting grasps in an arbitrary scene, doing 3D bounding box predictions. All of the capabilities that you would think would be useful to have in a model for robotics. Understanding spatial grounding, understanding relations, and so on. We add this data to the VLM, so we make Gemini a better model for robotics. And then on top of that, we actually adapt this VLM into a VLA in the ways that every other paper we've looked at has been doing. So you add a lot of diverse robotics data, which has language labels. It is fairly language-grounded data. And then we fine-tune these models, starting from this embodied reasoning Gemini model, down into a robotics-specific VLA, which is the Gemini Robotics VLA. And this would be the pre-training step. So this notion of pre-training and post-training here would be pre-training is where you do diverse data, you make this model, and then you specialize it for a lot of downstream tasks. So if you care about doing more dexterous things, you would take this VLA, fine-tune it to do really dexterous things. If you care about transferring to new embodiments like humanoid robots or bimanual pandas, which were not in pre-training, you would start with the pre-trained model, fine-tune it, and so on. So for the rest of the next few minutes, we'll primarily talk about the actions model, the Gemini Robotics VLA. We train this VLA model on a large amount of diverse data. We have a fleet of Aloha robots, which is what you see on the top, and we collected thousands of hours of Aloha robots over a year, Aloha robot data over a year, which contains diverse tasks, objects, different manipulation skills, different ways of solving the task, right-handedness, left-handedness, different episode horizons, and really, really dexterous things. And this VLA that you're looking at, again, just to be clear, is from a black box perspective, very similar to every model we've looked at in this talk so far. So you have an image, which is the visual observations that the robot takes. You have a language prompt, which is the task, which tells you what task you're solving. You pass it to this Gemini robotics model. This is a hybrid model, so because it's based on top of this Gemini model, which is a giant VLM of I don't know how many parameters. A good chunk of the model actually runs in the cloud, and a lot of it runs locally. So we split computation so that we have a cloud backbone, which is the primary VLM backbone, and then a local action decoder so that you can control these robots in real time at 50 hertz. And then eventually you have your robot, which you're conditioning there. And all of this put together gives you this VLA that's running on a fleet of Aloha robots, solving hundreds of different tasks with all sorts of different objects and everything else. So everything you see here is 1x autonomous, a single policy doing all of these tasks. So maybe checking off the generality axis that we talked about. This is a single policy that can manipulate a lot of these different settings, different objects, different colors, full laundry, pack your bags, whatever. So going back to the first part where we talked about how I would trust that a policy that's given to me is general, I would want to start with a base task and come up with visual, semantic, and behavioral perturbations of these tasks, and then evaluate them to see how good my policy is. Now, the first section we just talked about single arm, but let's look at what this looks like for the bi-arm setting. So in this case, as an example, there were 20 or so different tasks, but as an example, let's say this is the scene that you care about. It's a fairly busy scene with a lot of different fruits, and you're trying to pack a lunch bag with a lot of different objects in it. So different visual perturbations of this could be having distractor objects that are not that important to the task, having a different background, which in this case is a white piece of cloth on the table, or having this lighting condition which completely saturates a part of your image. And what we see on the right is maybe a report of our model, which is the blue Gemini robotics model, Pi0, which is this the new generation of VLA models that we evaluated before, and the green is just multitask diffusion, which is a much smaller model. And we see across the board that while there is definitely performance drop out of distribution, visual generalization generally seems to hold very flat. This is kind of true even in the first part where we saw that if you were able to add distractors or change backgrounds, because of the diverse data that we've been training on, visual generalization is something that's mostly covered, and this stays true even for really large models. Things start getting a little bit more interesting in the semantic sense. So again, let's say you have this lunchbox scene and your task is to put a very specific grape, which is the top left grape, into the right compartment of the gray box. This is a very, very specific instruction. And anything else, if it's done, it's considered a failure. And in terms of semantic generalization of the different axes that we had at the start on our taxonomy, 4 ones that look very interesting here to show is this is a typo. So the compartment and right and box is just misspelled. And if you truly believe that your language model is a language model, it should not be bothered by things like misspelling. We have different languages. You can speak to your model in French or in Spanish, and it's going to try to, if it's a good model, it will hopefully work, and it'll keep working. We talk about rephrasing, which is a different way of speaking, a different way of commanding the same instruction and then adding different levels of descriptiveness. And here, very similar to what we saw before, again, the model does see a bigger drop in performance. It still continues to work. It still outperforms baseline. All of that is great. But typically, despite this being a language model backbone, we start seeing performance drops when you do very simple things like being more descriptive or just trying to do a little bit of typos. Your Gemini model on your phone does not suffer from typos, but clearly, when you do actions post-training, something happens which is making it worse. And maybe this is where a lot of the ongoing steps and next steps of research are going to be, trying to understand why there is a drop in such trivial things which your VLM should be really good at. But generally speaking, very impressed by all the new language and all the fun things that we saw there. And the last one, where things actually start looking even more grim, is behavior generalization, which in part 1, as you saw, there was a lot of drop in performance, and we really need to figure out what to do there. So in this case, we're looking at 2 different kinds of behavior generalization task perturbations. So in the first case, we have different initial positions, and we were careful to sample these initial positions such that there was never this specific configuration in our pre-training data. Similarly, on the right, we have on the right top, which I think is very interesting, there is pre-training data for the vitamin water bottle and tightening the cap of that bottle, but it's never seen this white bottle or this other transparent plastic bottle. But if you truly think you have a generalist policy, it should really realize that tightening the cap of a bottle doesn't depend on the color of the bottle. Similarly, if you're doing folding dresses and you have different sizes of dresses, which you can see, how well does it work? And unsurprisingly, what you notice is if you change the object instance, performance tanks quite a lot. So we suffer a lot when we have a completely new object. And that is something which is true for every baseline, but even for our premier model, we see this happening. Clearly looks like initial position is not something we need to worry about, and the model continues performing very well. But generally, this notion of new object instances and generating very, very new behaviors remains challenging. And lastly, the thing I wanted to talk about, which is steerability. We talked about the second really nice property to have for these models is the fact that you can command them in natural language and they would follow what you want to do. So we set up 2 tasks. We set up 5 tasks. There's 2 of them I'm showing here. One with seen objects, one with unseen objects. And then you come up with 5 different instructions for the same starting position. So in this case, for the robot to be successful, it needs to really understand that what a blue clip is and what a calculator is and what it means to be on the right and what it means to be in the white basket. And when we evaluate across all of these different settings, again, what we see is generally we retain a lot of steerability in this model. And this is the kind of videos that we showed at the start. If you can do the right kind of relabeling and language grounding for your data, you can actually boost up steerability quite a bit, which is something we found lacking in a lot of open source models. I'll skip videos. I think all of these are online. There's a lot of them, so I'm just going to skip all of them. And just to give back some time, first, maybe I want to thank all my collaborators who led the work, especially Sunil, Jensen, Laura, and Kat, and the whole team at Google Deepmind, Robotics, whose work I presented. And I'll just stop here. We can take questions from here.